The Mongols were winning. They had destroyed armies in Poland, broken Hungary, and pushed deep into Central Europe. By 1241, they looked almost unstoppable. So why did they suddenly leave? Europe hadn't defeated them. No great European army had driven them back. The Mongols simply turned around. And the reason is more complicated than one battle. Because the Mongols had discovered something every expanding empire eventually faces. Defeating armies is one thing. Holding conquered territory is another. By the late 1230s, the Mongol Empire had become the largest contiguous land empire in history. Now Mongol armies under Ögedei Khan and the brilliant commander Subutai were moving west. They had already conquered enormous territories across the Eurasian steppe and the lands of the Rus. Then they pushed towards Central Europe. The first warning came in Poland. Mongol forces moved rapidly across the region, defeating a Polish-led army at Legnica in April 1241. But that wasn't their main objective. Farther south, Hungary was waiting. And what happened there would make the Mongol advance look almost unstoppable. On April 11, 1241, the Hungarian army confronted the Mongols at the Battle of Mohi. The Mongols broke the Hungarian army. The defeat was devastating. King Bela IV fled, and the Mongols pushed deeper into Hungary. Settlements were destroyed. Populations were devastated. The Hungarian kingdom was thrown into crisis. And the Mongols didn't stop at the battlefield. They pursued Bela as he fled westward. By the end of 1241, Mongol forces had pushed deep into Central Europe. And now, the obvious question seemed to have an obvious answer. What would stop them? Because if they could destroy Hungary, what stood between them and the rest of Europe? Then, something happened thousands of miles away. In December 1241, Ögedei Khan died. He was the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, and his death created a succession crisis at the center of the empire. The political leadership of the Mongol world now faced a fundamental question. Who would become the next great Khan? For the commanders operating in Europe, this mattered. Their campaign was connected to an empire whose political center was thousands of miles away, and now that center had been disrupted. At first glance, the mystery seemed solved. Ögedei died. The Mongols withdrew. But there's a problem. The Mongols didn't simply abandon Europe because their emperor died. The situation on the ground was becoming more complicated too. And that is where this story gets interesting. The Mongols were extraordinarily effective at defeating armies. But Central Europe wasn't just a collection of armies waiting to be destroyed. There were fortified settlements, rivers, forests, marshes, and increasingly difficult terrain. The Mongols could move rapidly across open country, but permanently controlling territory required something very different. It required garrisons, supplies, communications, and soldiers left behind to hold what had already been conquered. And Hungary was beginning to adapt. King Bela IV survived the invasion, and after the Mongol withdrawal, he would rebuild Hungary's defenses, including a greater reliance on stone fortifications. The strategic problem was changing. It wasn't simply, can the Mongols defeat the Hungarians? They had already demonstrated that they could. The harder question was, can they permanently control Hungary from thousands of miles away? And that was a much more difficult problem. This is what makes the withdrawal so difficult to explain with one sentence. The Mongols weren't fighting for Europe alone. They were managing an empire that stretched across enormous distances. Every new conquest created another frontier. Every frontier required troops. Every army needed supplies. Every distant campaign depended on communication with a political center far to the east. And now, the political center was dealing with a succession crisis. At the same time, the European campaign was encountering stronger fortifications and the practical difficulties of holding conquered territory. So Ögedei's death may have been a major trigger, but it was not necessarily the entire explanation. Historians have debated how much weight each factor deserves, and that uncertainty actually makes the withdrawal more fascinating. because there wasn't necessarily one moment when someone decided, Europe has defeated us. There wasn't. Then, in 1242, the Mongols withdrew. Their forces moved away from Central Europe. The campaign stopped. And here's the strange part. They had not been decisively defeated. There was no massive European victory that destroyed the Mongol army. No battlefield catastrophe suddenly shattered the invasion. The Mongols simply left. Think about what had happened only months earlier. At Legnica, they had defeated a major Polish-led force. At Mohi, they had destroyed the Hungarian army. They had pushed deep into Central Europe. They had pursued Bela IV toward the Adriatic. And yet, they weren't going to continue the conquest. Europe had survived, but it hadn't exactly won. This is where the simple version of the story breaks down. For years, people have pointed to Ögedei's death as the explanation, and it clearly mattered. But the evidence doesn't allow us to reduce the entire withdrawal to one cause with certainty. The Mongols were operating far from their main power base. They faced fortified positions. They faced local resistance. The terrain and communications created difficulties. And conquering territory was becoming a different task from defeating armies. The political situation at the center of the empire had also changed. So the withdrawal is better understood as the result of several pressures converging at the same time. And that distinction matters. Because the Mongols weren't suddenly incapable of fighting. They were confronting a different strategic calculation. Imagine the problem from the Mongol perspective. You defeat an army. You capture its territory. Then what? You have to control it. You need troops. You need supplies. You need communication. You need to defend the territory from resistance. And every mile farther from your main power base makes those problems harder. The Mongols had built their empire around extraordinary mobility. That was one of their greatest strengths. But mobility could win campaigns faster than an empire could necessarily absorb the territory those campaigns created. And Central Europe was now forcing the Mongols to confront that problem. They could win battles. But winning battles didn't automatically mean permanent conquest. And this is probably the most important part of the story. The Mongols were not driven out of Europe by some decisive European counterattack. They weren't stopped because their military system suddenly failed. They weren't defeated at the gates of some great European capital. Instead, the campaign ended before the Mongols completed the conquest. That's a very different story. Europe didn't simply overpower the Mongols. The Mongol leadership faced a changing political situation at home, while the campaign itself presented increasingly difficult problems of distance, fortification, resistance, and occupation. And eventually, continuing west was no longer an obvious choice. The Mongols had solved one of the hardest problems in warfare: how to destroy armies across enormous distances. But every conquest created another problem. How do you hold what you've taken? In Central Europe, those two problems began separating. The Mongols could cross the continent. They could defeat armies. They could devastate kingdoms. But permanent control required something different. It required an enduring political and military presence. And that meant resources, time, soldiers, supplies, and political stability at the center of the empire. In 1241, the Mongol advance looked unstoppable. By 1242, it had stopped. The Mongols had destroyed Hungary's army. They had defeated forces in Poland. They had pushed deep into Europe. They had pursued King Bela IV, and Europe had not defeated them. Yet the Mongols still withdrew. Ögedei's death had changed the political situation. The campaign faced the difficulties of operating at the far edge of an enormous empire, and the challenge of turning military victories into permanent occupation was becoming harder. We cannot reduce the withdrawal to a single certain cause, but we can see the larger lesson. The Mongols knew how to conquer. But conquest created another question. How do you keep what you've conquered? And that is why the Mongol withdrawal from Europe remains so remarkable. They weren't driven out. They weren't destroyed. They weren't decisively defeated. They stopped. The army that had smashed Hungary turned around and left. And Europe was left with a strange historical reality. The Mongols had reached Central Europe, but they never conquered it.